thank you so much for coming out today. I am Thomas POLK, regarded as one of the three founders of Charlotte. I, being a land surveyor of a humble origin, my great-grandfather was Robert Bruce POLK, which of course probably provides you with a hint of our Scottish ancestry. Immigrated from Ulster to Maryland, where he established roots. And of course, being the industrious Scotch-Irishman that he was, established himself prominently in Maryland, and then through the second generation continued to accumulate wealth. And then my parents migrated on to Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, where I and my other siblings were born. I and my brother migrated south here into what was known as Anson County in North Carolina. A huge, huge province in its own right. A vast territory, a vast wilderness. Explored, yes. Settled very sparsely. Then I, with other settlers who took the wagon road south, had established our own homes. We married, had children, and of course, being the land surveyor that I was, had surveyed the hilltop that came to be known as Charlotte. I and the three land speculators acquired 360 acres of that land, part of which you are standing on at this moment. I had laid out the town lots, and then of course, being a member of the Colonial Assembly, had established the bill, had sponsored the bill to establish Mecklenburg County in the year 1762. And then, of course, in the year 1767, had helped to sponsor the bill that established Charlotte. Now, we continued to work during that time to establish ourselves. Of course, we helped Governor Tryon during the regulator movement, early 1770s, a peasant rebellion, farmers, disorganized rabble, helped to put that down. Many were surprised that I would take that position, but it was politically expedient to do so at that time. Now, of course, during the 1770s, we were quite aware of what was taking place throughout the colonies, and of course, what was taking place in Massachusetts. Just because we were far and far away from the coast didn't mean that we were ignorant of these affairs. It simply meant that we wanted to be left alone from these affairs until it was something that threatened our own means of existence and our own lives and well-being. And of course, the events that took place in Massachusetts, the closure of the port of Boston in '74, that became a rallying point for the colonies and the committees of correspondence, and later the committees of safety that were established, to rally together and to begin to find ways that we could organize and to provide aid and support to our brethren in Boston. And in the early spring of '75, here in Mecklenburg County, our own committees began to meet and to discuss what was to be done to provide support for our brethren. And then it was resolved that at our next meeting in May, the 19th, that representatives, 2 representatives from the county's 9 militia districts would meet at the courthouse in Charlotte and discuss ways to provide support. I will never forget that day, 19th of May, we were all gathered in the courthouse, discussing, deliberating, finding ways of finding compromise, and without tipping the bucket one way or the other. This was still a radical idea of going against Parliament and the Crown. It was practically a suicidal venture that could have been taken. The world's most powerful army. Then, an express rider from Salisbury had arrived with news that blood had been spilt on the green at Lexington and at Concord in Massachusetts. In fact, that very event took place 250 years ago, this day, in Lexington. Of course, this was a month after the fact. It gives you some perspective of how fast news traveled back in the colonial era. We didn't have your instant messenger of the day that you have today. Well, with that news, the conversation shifted from what should we do to aid our brethren in Boston to one of what should we do here in the county of Mecklenburg to make it perfectly clear that the inhabitants and the residents of Charlottetown and Mecklenburg County were not going to stand any longer for this tyrannical and abusive treatment in the hands of the British Army, and for that matter, the policies of the British Parliament or the North Carolina Assembly. It was determined on that day, consideration of declaring our independence altogether from the mother country. It's an insane proposition. But gradually, over a period of time, the voices of discontent ceased. They ceased. And the voices of freedom rang out. It was determined that a statement to that effect should be framed, should be made. And that committee of 3 men from that delegation included my son-in-law, Reverend Doctor. Yes. Our wonderful, wonderful son-in-law.
Married to our daughter Martha, one of our 3 girls.
Yes. Dr. Ephraim Bavard. And then, of course, William Kennan, being a brilliant orator that he was. And a third man who's Thomas Frohoff. Came together at Liberty Hall.
His memory is not what it once was.
Over 250 years, it does get a little bit hazy. So, bear with me. Met at Liberty Hall. And they drafted what came to be known as the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. On noon, the 20th of May, is when I read the Declaration from the steps of the courthouse. And in fact, on the 20th of May this year, 2025, I will be reading it again at Trade and Triumph. Would you all like to hear a reading of the Mecklenburg Declaration? Very well. Resolved that whosoever directly or indirectly abetted or in any way, form, or manner countenance the uncharted and dangerous invasion of our rights as claimed by Great Britain is an enemy to this county, to America, and to the inherent and inalienable rights of man. Huzzah!
Huzzah!
Resolved that we, the citizens of Mecklenburg County, do hereby dissolve the political bands which have connected us to the mother country, and hereby absolve ourselves from all allegiance to the British Crown, and abjure all political connection, contract, or association with that nation. who have wantonly trampled on our rights and liberties and inhumanely shed the innocent blood of American patriots at Lexington. Huzzah! Resolve that we do hereby declare ourselves a free and independent people, are and of right ought to be a sovereign and self-governing association under the control of no power other than that of our God and the General Congress, to the maintenance of which independence we solemnly pledge to each other our mutual cooperation, our lives, our fortunes, and our most sacred honor. Huzzah!
Huzzah!
Resolved that as we acknowledge the existence and control of no law or legal officer, civil or military, within this county, we do hereby ordain and adopt as a rule of life all, each and every of our former laws, where nevertheless the Crown of Great Britain never can be considered as holding rights, privileges, immunities, or authority therein. Resolved. Huzzah!
Huzzah!
Resolved that it is also further decreed that all, each and every military officer in this county is hereby reinstated to his former command and authority, he acting conformably to these regulations, and that every member present of this delegation shall henceforth be a civil officer, a justice of the peace, in the character of a committee man, to issue, process, hear, and determine all matters of controversy according to said adopted laws, and to preserve peace and union and harmony in said county, and to use every exertion to spread the love of country and fire of freedom throughout America until a more general and organized government be established in this province. 3 cheers for freedom and liberty. Hip hip huzzah! Hip hip huzzah! Hip hip huzzah! And that, my friends, is how it was done.
Good job.
Now, of course, after that, it was a mighty declaration of intent. And everyone on that day was filled with this spirit of intent. Having the sense to do so. Well, that December in South Carolina is when we had our little taste of war. It wasn't against the British Army per se, but it was against the loyalists in the back country. Those who failed to sign the association pledge of South Carolina to remain loyal to the rebel government of that time. There was a large contingent of us that went to South Carolina to fight against the Tories. At 96, we managed to suppress the Tories, but my son William was injured during the snow campaign. Had a lead ball shot through his shoulder. He was brought back here to Charlotte. It's where our future son-in-law, Dr. Ephraim Brevard, had become quite acquainted with our wonderful daughter Martha. They took a liking to one another and married. Soon thereafter, they had a daughter of their own. And for a time, Ephraim continued in his services here. It was a good time to have him. But when the war did come in full force with the British invasion, which they took on the 12th of May, 1780, Charlestown. It's when his services as a surgeon was needed. On that day, the 12th of May, following a month-long siege, Sir Henry Clinton and his second, Lord Cornwallis, managed to capture Charlottetown. Over 5,500 Continental soldiers and militia forces, many of them from here in North Carolina, have been captured. It was the worst loss in the war up to that point. Many of those men were sent to the prison ships stationed in Charlestown Harbor. And that was the equivalent of a death sentence because of the prison fever. Doctors and nurses were sent and allowed to tend to the sick and dying aboard those prison ships. And Ephraim volunteered his services as a doctor. Eventually, he too got very, very ill. And as British captors knew that he had little time, they allowed him to be secured from his duties. And Ephraim walked from Charlestown back here to Charlotte.
What he did not know is that in his absence, our dear Martha had already passed.
Very, very difficult time for our family. Martha had died of sickness as well. When Ephraim returned, I didn't recognize him. He was in a very serious state of health. He managed to spend the time writing his last will, testament. And he asked us to raise our granddaughter, and he died. Sadly, where he was buried has been lost to time. But we have a memorial to him in front of the cemetery. After that time, it was very difficult for me. I served in the Continental Line as a colonel. I served alongside General Washington at Brandywine and Germantown. I was at Valley Forge. In fact, my regiment, the 4th North Carolina Regiment, was responsible for helping to secure what you refer to as the Liberty Bell from being captured. But it was also a time when men were deserting the army. And that was the case with the 4th North Carolina Regiment. I had come back to North Carolina with the hopes that I could recruit more men. But in my absence, I learned that my regiment had been folded into the 2nd North Carolina Regiment. I was passed over from being promoted to a general. And I felt it necessary to come back to tend to affairs here in Charlotte during the remainder of the war. So we were here, of course, when Cornwallis, on the 26th of September, invaded Charlottetown. Despite the valiant resistance that was put up by our 250 militiamen against a staggering army under Cornwallis, we had lost the town. But it was not for long in which there would be a major engagement that would take place 40 miles to the west, a place in South Carolina called Kings Mountain. And it was there where a major engagement took place between the South Carolina Loyalists and the Whigs, Scotch-Irish, from what is today East Tennessee, the Over Mountain settlements, in Virginia, and North Carolina, and yes, some from South Carolina, had fought on the 7th of October, 1780. And on that day, the left wing of his lordship's army had been wiped out. And the commander of the Loyalists, of course, being Patrick Ferguson, quite the scoundrel that he was killed in that engagement. Initially, his lordship did not receive that news because while his lordship was here in Charlottetown, we were taking every opportunity to harass the British at every turn. And that included, of course, harassing the foraging parties, going into the countryside and pilfering all of the farms and plantations, because you have to feed and provision an army. Well, during that time of their occupation, there was one such engagement that took place about 7 miles north on Beatty's Ford at John McIntyre's farm. On that day, it was observed that this large foraging party was lumbering slowly out of Charlotte and advancing on Beatty's Ford. All the neighbors were alerted to this, including the first neighbor, who was John McIntyre. And the local militia was called out. When they arrived at McIntyre's farm, they hid in the woods in preparation for this foraging party. When the foraging party arrived, they began to do what the British typically do: pilfer and pillage. And then, as it happened, there were a couple of soldiers that had with them a couple of dogs that were leashed. Somehow the dogs got loose from their handlers and began to run. And the handlers began to chase the dogs. And in that melee, one of those soldiers knocked over a beehive it's kept. And of course, that caused quite the distraction, as the other men were ridiculing and laughing the men who were getting stung by the bees. Our boys that were hid out in the woods, in sequence, in unison, prime loaded and fired their muskets on that party, which alarmed them. And of course, they got back on the road to Beatty's and they headed back to Charlotte. It became known as the Battle of the Bees, or the Battle of McIntyre's Farm. It was 2 days after the Battle of Kings Mountain in which his lordship Cornwallis had learned about the defeat at Kings Mountain. And that is when he decided that he too should, because of his bad reception, that he was not welcomed as a liberator into Charlottetown, should perhaps reconsider advancing further into North Carolina, and retreating back into South Carolina and to Windsor. Such a time. Those were the most memorable times.
Sign of God's providence.
Definitely a sign of God's providence. And this is also a sign of God's providence for me.
Are you sure it wasn't because of who my father was?
Thomas Spratt,
Perhaps.
a very good, industrious father-in-law. A very good marriage.
For us both, I think.
8 children. 5 boys, 3 girls of our own.
I guess we got along okay.
And then there were the others that we took in. Of course,
Unhappy circumstances. But good family.
well, after the war, of course, we received our independence as we had desired since 75. And it was a time of establishing a new republic. Of course, General Washington came back into the fold and serving in public life as our first president of the United States. And during President Washington's second term as president, he took a tour of the new republic. And he saved the last leg of that tour for the best. That, of course, was the southern tour, which he came south, first into North Carolina, out of Virginia, then south into South Carolina, to Charlestown, over to Augusta, over to Camden, and then north from Camden here to Charlotte, in which we entertained him that evening that he came to Charlotte.
A grand reception.
A very grand reception. You are the most wonderful.
But yet, what did he say about us after he left? He called us, what was that word?
A trifling place. Apparently, he was not impressed with Charlottetown. Perhaps it was because he had left his box of wig powder behind, and nobody bothered to return it to him. So, what questions do you have for me or my wife?
What box did he leave behind?
A box of wig powder. Yes. Powdered wigs.
You know how those men loved their powder.
We have black powder, white powder, black powder being a little bit more explosive than the white powder.
The white powder was only explosive for President Washington's temper.
Without a doubt. Yes. Questions for me, madam? No?
I do believe they have stood here long enough, my dear Thomas.
Oh, yes. I do
They may want to
appreciate.
adjourn to another location.
Yes. I guess I've spent too much time visiting
He's
Southern Ireland in the afterlife. For I've been told that I've kissed the Blarney Stone many, many times. So thank you so much.
Thank you.